Hi, and welcome. I'm Jonathan Rowson, Director of Perspectiva, and I'm welcoming with me today some colleagues from Perspectiva who will be speaking together about what just happened in America and what it means for all of us. And we try to do this a little differently. There's no lack of commentary on that, of course. We don't want to add to the noise. But we are quite interested to consider deeper currents of what's been going on. For instance, the role of kind of informational warfare and the challenge that places epistemically to make sense of the world, and whether that might be some kind of deep threat to democracy as such. We're also interested in sort of cultural and economic and social trends that may give rise to some of what we witnessed on January the 6th and make better sense of what that was. And also backing out a little bit to think about, as a Brit and with people who are non-Americans also speaking, why does American politics seem to matter so much? Why does it feel like it's where it's at? And then when we're electing an American president, there is some sense in which it sometimes feels like we're electing a president of the world, which of course is not the case. And yet it can sometimes operate that way. So we're going to go throughout this conversation trying to keep a hold of the underlying issues, the deeper sources of what's going on. We're less concerned with Biden's policy choices and whether or not things will work out on climate change. We're more concerned with what just happened in terms of the previous administration, the new administration, and what we're learning about the sort of the health of democracy and what that might mean for the world as a whole. And the title is reflecting of that. We're interested in the logos and the mythos and the health of democracy in general. And we're just going to see where it goes. Okay, so we're going to start with some Americans because we have three of them with us. And we're going to start with Zak Stein to reflect on his sense of what's going on there. And we'll take it from there. Zak, over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. It is hard to know what to say, and so much has been said in terms of commenting on the past few weeks, really, which was kind of the climax of the past 4 years, which was the climax of the past few decades. And what came to mind as I was thinking about this, because you got me thinking about like America. And I remember when I was a child, I was probably like in 3rd or 4th grade, we drove up Pikes Peak. And so Pikes Peak's in Colorado. It's one of the tallest mountains in the United States. And you get to the top and I got altitude sickness. It's so high. And you can just see the expanses when you look to the east. And I had this overwhelming sense of how huge the United States was. And as a child, the bigness of something is related to its importance. And then I had this sense of like fear. It was like a sublime experience in the Kantian sense of the aesthetic experience, where it was both beautiful and terrifying. And the terrified sense I had was actually one of the terror of the responsibility of being the United States. We had so much, literally land, it was just so big. And then as I grew up, of course, I went, Chomsky, Wallerstein, Harvey, like into the critique of neoliberalism, looking at the American military industrial complex, seeing even more the size and the responsibility and the kind of like fear that come, like the incomprehensibility of how big this one country became. And then that's framed because of the way the United States and specifically New York and then LA became the kind of megapolises that broadcast and kind of framed the United States to the world, that even if it appeared bigger than it even was, it became mythic, to use your term. And there's a love-hate relationship, I think, between the rest of the world and the United States, and between many United States citizens and the United States. And so the other experience I had at the top of Pikes Peak was a kind of a quasi-mystical experience with a kind of God bless America. Whoa, like the size of the Rockies, like the majesty, right? And so it's important to remember how significant the founding of the United States was as a geohistorical event, and the way that chickens come home to roost, that we placed ourselves to become some kind of global catalyst. And this is continuing to happen for better and for worse. So history now is moving faster than our minds and hearts can keep up with. And what has occurred in the past 3 weeks was, in a sense, crossing the event horizon of some kind of epistemological black hole. We are now in a situation where we can't go back to what was, and this is both an infrastructural. So we cross that, that's like a tipping point in the complex system of a physiological infrastructural cascade, but we've also crossed like this event horizon of some kind of epistemological black hole where there's no going back to making sense of the world the way it used to be either. And yeah, so that I think is the thing to understand, is that it's unclear what to say right now. It's hard to know the historical significance of something when you are living in it. And so the sense we have of wanting to clamp down on assurity and certainty, and taking views that are plausible about the situation and deeming them as certain in order to secure a sense of knowing what's happening in the world. This is an understandable tendency, but it's one of the things that's dialing in the polarization and other things. So I'll kind of end on that point of the negative capability and the liminal historicity as it relates to our identity means something like it's hard to know what to say and who to be at this point in history. So we return to something more metaphysical, something more metapsychological. And so I prefer not to actually make strong statements about what is the case with politics and instead refocus on the level at which the ensoulment dynamics for me and my family and others that I love are taking place. It's something I've said before. And so this is the metapsychological and metapolitical move of not allowing yourself to be swept up in the insanity. And again, insanity is often like thinking you know something is real when you actually don't know that's real at all, but you're convinced that it's real, that it really happened that way. And so we need to be careful and be comfortable in the other modalities of our being that aren't related to fact stating about world events. Because right now it's very, very hard to know what is the case. So yeah, I have more to say, but I think I'll leave it there because there'll be other opportunities to speak. And that was a lot and not really what I was planning to say. So we'll see where that goes.
It's always thus, but I will come back to you on epistemological black hole, but just hold that thought for now while we go on to Bonnitta. I haven't been introducing you. I'm going to do all that in the show notes just to save time, but Bonnitta, go ahead.
Yeah, so I took a different tact. And first of all, I wanted to resist the move to try to get ahead or get above, can I get ahead of the news cycle so I can understand it? Can I get above the complexity so I can capture it? So I didn't want to do that. And I also wanted to stay in the spirit of the invitation. So when I start out, it's going to sound like I'm not in the spirit of the invitation, but I will get there. So the question you pose is, what just happened in America? And so what I want to say, I have a little bullet list here. I would say what happened was the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. I would say that there's a centralized control of the supply chain. I would say that there is vast expansion of the surveillance system. I would say that there was an unprecedented shift down on free speech, a huge increase in food insecurity, housing insecurity, job insecurity. The complete shutdown of education happened. The enormous transfer of power to biotechnopharma, comparable now in power to the military-industrial complex. The unprecedented transfer of individual liberties, freedoms, and opportunity to state definition and control, not to mention the little expansion of the control of what we do with our bodies. The irreversible trend toward AI-vectored environmental response, the Green New Deal coupled with the Internet of Things, i.e. the elimination of all alternatives from public discourse, and people being pushed further downstream from the algorithms, which now control political and social discourse for perverse incentives. So if you ask me what I think happened in America, I say that's what happened in America. Now, some of these people will see them as goods, few probably. Some will see them as evils. Most people will see them as necessary evils. For example, the transfer of wealth could be seen as a necessary evil due to quantitative easing that began in 2008 at the end of the recession and is still in, I think it's 15th phase now or something like that. But what I think is really interesting is that despite all this, all the discourse has been around Trump. All the conversation is Trumpism, what Trump is doing, you know, and the food fights on both sides of the conversation. Very little discourse around, I think, these concrete changes, these concrete realities of what's been happening. So that's an interesting thing. And of course, I put one more thing on the list, and that is COVID. I mean, COVID happened. And I believe that COVID and Trump will go down in history together. And it's interesting because it only kind of occurred in his last year. And there's something very self-symbolic about that. And I started to think about this, and I thought of a metaphor that is helpful to me. And so the question, why does it matter to the world? The question became, does democracy have an immune system? And I thought this was a very interesting metaphor because immune system, you know, Keegan's immunity to change is very interesting because an immune system is immune to change on the one hand. And we want a certain amount of inertia in our system, a certain amount of stability, right? We don't want like these huge executive orders to keep changing things. And people want to know what is their country? What are our common goals? But then we also need an immune system response. So protests on the streets, free speech. These are all positive immune system responses in a democracy that are essential, I think, for the health of democracy. But then there's something really interesting. And this is so bizarre, the way it's inspired by COVID, that these other diseases are autoimmune overwhelm. They're autoimmune diseases. So the immune system response becomes itself the disease. And of course, this is kind of what we see in the media. You know, we can have such an overreaction to Trump that the immune system keeps fighting, you know, the never again Trump, the never again Trump. And I think what you'll see is the entrenchment of some of these things that I put on the list in the beginning, just because the autoimmune system takes on a momentum of its own and it's on kind of an autopilot. And so my hope is that we can return the discourse to concrete intentions and free discourse around them. What do we want to change and how are we going to change it? And I think too much of the conversation is, how are we going to change people's minds? And that's probably an autoimmune system disease. And get down to real platform issues. And we need, the more complex they are, the more perspectives we need on it, the more context we need on it, and the more multiple approaches we need on it. And that's not a loss of sense making. That's not a lack of unity or, you know, the loss of convergence. That is the explosion of possibility and hope, I think. So yeah, that's how the questions inspired me. And I thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. I definitely want to speak more about democracy as an immune system, or having an immune system, and much of what we're seeing being a kind of autoimmune response. It's a fascinating angle on it. We'll go now to Jeremy, please. You're coming in from Florida, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Just to be clear, for those who are interested in these things, I think we're looking at Vermont, Connecticut, and Florida. Is that right? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Good to be here. Yeah, this is quite a loaded subject. Obviously, just a 1 hour or 90-minute session probably wouldn't do it justice. But I think what I'm coming in with is actually dovetailing a little bit with Bonnitta. I'm reminded of the Varoufakis statement earlier this summer about financial capitalism decoupling from the capitalist economy over the summer, so that capitalism has finally figured out what's post-capitalist, and it is a more abstracted, more decoupled, more out of this world orientation, right? So we're dealing with tremendous socioeconomic upheavals during this 2020 year. And we really have to look, if we're going to examine the QAnon word, the Q word, and the Q phenomenon, and how did it play into this, what happened in the Capitol. A lot of people, I think it hit them like a meteor. They weren't expecting this. But if we've been following some of the conditions and the bubbling up of discontents this year, I think not that it was necessarily predictable, but something like this would eventually happen, right? And I think part of this is really kind of tracing what like Daniel Bessner and Amber Frost talk about as the sources of illegitimacy that are genuine discontents by many individuals that really drove the communities and the people who latch onto QAnon in a very syncretic way, right? Because it appeals to the New Ager mom. It appeals to the MAGA hatting, gun-toting rural guy, right? It appeals many different communities. The feelings of alienation, distrust of our democratic system, that they're being represented, right? The feelings of meaninglessness, these are all drivers. And actually, if you talk to, or if you've read interviews with folks who have gotten out of QAnon, they cite this. They cite life was really boring. I didn't really have a sense of connection. And all of a sudden I'm connected to this global community that makes sense of the world. That's deeply empowering, right? So there's a lot of emotional or psycho-spiritual drives that I think led people to gather into this strange syncretic, as Bessner and Frost call it, cult. And these are certainly psycho-spiritual, but I wouldn't say they're healthy forms. I think they're more of, now you and I were talking about this idea with Ken Wilber of the pre-trans fallacy, really kind of mistaking some kind of expression as something that's evolved or something that's spiritually transcendent. And really it's something else. It's something more pathological or something that is sort of an unhealthy form, or perhaps an earlier undeveloped form. So there's these elements that I think are at play here, but I think what we really have to keep in mind are the material conditions, A, that have happened this year, and B, that have led to this year. Talking about the financial collapse, right, of 2008, this financial collapse, being stuck in our homes with only the internet to look at. And then, of course, over the past 30 or 40 years, the erosion of those institutions in the social democracy that would have helped prevent something like this from happening. Without those things in place, I think what we do begin to see is more eruptions and more unhealthy compulsions towards, deficient magic and mythic. I'll kind of pause here to test the waters, but that's really the core of what I wanted to share. Oh, you're muted, Jonathan.
I know. I just did it just to tease you, of course. I want to ask some clarifying questions, so we understand what you're all saying, so that it's a bit easier for Anna, Mark, and Minna to respond. First of all, Jeremy, because you went last, sources of illegitimacy was quite a powerful line. And you did speak to that to some extent, but if you could summarize the sense of illegitimacy and where that's coming from, what are the main drivers of that? Are they primarily socioeconomic, or is there something else going on as well?
I definitely think it's both. I think, at the most obvious level is socioeconomic. People feel disempowered. They don't feel like they have any kind of third spaces to connect to plug into. Unions have obviously kind of collapsed over the past 40 years. But it's not just unions, right? It's also this sense of community and social belonging, which has also suffered. I mean, if you take the New Left's perspective under this ideology of consumer neoliberalism, right? It's a deeply atomizing force. So this moves us right out of the economic and into these deeper spiritual questions and human questions about, well, if you have a very alienated populace that's seeking a meaningful connection with other people, and you leave that kind of stoking and percolating for a few decades, you might begin to see very pathological expressions of that sense of belonging, like QAnon.
And that's where I come to Zak's epistemological black hole, because I think elsewhere you wrote about the challenge of being epistemically incapacitated, which is a term I like, because it would seem to me that if there are these underlying social and economic drivers, and Bonnie also laid out some of them, and this is giving rise to certain psychosocial issues that are not altogether healthy, and that then they find manifestation, which others call spiritual, but might just be kind of paranoid or delusional or narcissistic or whatever. Some of that's coming from the information stream and the information ecology. And for me, what I find fascinating is that you can go from a person sitting at a computer, a kind of biological organism at a computer, receiving some kind of input in the form of information that does not somehow tally with the way the world is outside. And yet they can still build a more or less coherent world based on the information they have, if it doesn't come into contact with that world. And then they go out into that world, as it happened on January the 6th, or so it seemed, and they meet some other kind of reality, and it says, well, no, actually, what you thought was going on is not entirely what's going on. That wasn't just January 6th, though, right? What I want to get Zak to speak to a little more is, even Obama has spoken about an epistemological crisis, and he's got that word in the public discourse, which I think is it seems like a small achievement if you're in a community that's always speaking about epistemic this and epistemological that. But I think going to that level of astute abstraction, so that you're not just speaking about what people know, but also how they know them, and what the nature of a truth claim is, and how you make that valid or not and test it. It seems to me there is something like an epistemic or epistemological crisis. Now, we know that already. What I think is becoming clear, at least it looks to me, is that that's a sort of existential threat to democracy if it's not somehow checked, because democracy seems to depend on access to something resembling a shared world to disagree about. Zak, can you say more about how deep this problem goes, and what, if anything, we might do about it?
I mean, well, there's a few ways to frame it, right? We've, interestingly enough, as a species, passed through epistemic black holes before. Like, I've been studying the period around the 30 Years' War, which is kind of the birth of modernity, the birth of science, the birth of, you could argue, the epistemic epoch that's ending now. And that time period, it was confusing. Like, the printing press had been invented, and the Catholic Church invented propaganda. So the situation you describe of looking at something that's a technological invention, actually, that's like unprecedented, almost in your time, and then orienting through your imagination to a world that's presented to you through text, and you create your own reality, as they say, at least as an imaginal projection. And then that guy over there is actually reading very different books. And his reality is now, you are now projected in his imagination as an evil Protestant, and you will be burned and tortured, and etc. And what solidified that, like, this is the dignity of modernity, was a third objective perspective, ostensibly, of science, and the transfer of the notion of sovereignty and legitimacy from divine right to the people, right? And so that's what's changing, right? The crisis of legitimacy has to do as well with all the quadrants, right? All the socioeconomic factors that are in play, but it's related to this epistemic issue of the severe crisis of teacherly authority cascading into a crisis of legitimacy, which means we're not sure who to trust or what to believe. And not just because we've been duped by the media, but because society itself has become qualitatively more complex than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And again, like the printing press, we're looking at the digital. So that's kind of the notion of the event horizon. It's like we're through. No amount of thing can pull us back into the old way of stabilizing large-scale democracies. Like we could shut the internet off and just go back to TV, totally. And then we could just have Walter Cronkite again, stabilizing the epistemics of the country about what to believe. But someone would just reinvent the internet, right? It's because we've passed through this threshold. So there's a sense of now velocity towards something new, right? So there's a theory that you go through a black hole and you pop out a white hole somewhere else in the universe. So this is what's interesting about the moment. And it's, again, another way of framing the time between worlds moment. And it sounds abstract, but as I want to emphasize, Jeremy and Bonnitta said the things that I actually have in my notes that I was going to say about like all of the lower right-hand infrastructural, especially socioeconomic and, psychopathology inducing disruptions of culture and economic stuff. But that's part of the compounding of the epistemics. So it's not just about what we're reading and what we're looking at. It's about our lived experience of our world around us and our ability to even have the resources to think well, to have the time and energy and motivation to look at something that contradicts our instincts, et cetera. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah,
it was comforting to hear the reference to Cronkite, because my 1 year in the US, I stayed in the Cronkite Graduate Center, so that was a kind of home. So it's nice to hear that. Bonnie, your reference to the immune system really intrigues me, because my understanding of the immunity to change model, which is not central to what you said, but it's still, you alluded to it, is that often the way it works is that the reason we have immunity to change is that we have competing commitments, and those competing commitments somehow give rise to a great deal of energy in a system, whether it's a political system or a domestic system or even a psyche, and such that the way that Keegan uses the metaphor is that you put your foot on the gas and the brake at the same time. And that's a very different phenomenon from not doing anything at all. So there's a lot of energy percolating through, but nothing's actually happening. But I think what you're implying is that, well, maybe you're not, let's see if this is where you can respond, but there's something about democracy as an immune system, a way of understanding it metaphorically. Then there's a story of sort of autoimmune diseases, and what are they from, they're coming from within democracy somehow. So, and then there's a question of what one might hope to do about that. And it's as if the immune system has its own immune system, and where does that end? So talk me through that, and then we'll come on to the others to get some lateral perspective.
That was a good segue, because introducing Keegan's notion of like the energy and the break at the same time introduces that there's competing interests or conflicts or a disconnect. And I don't want to make too much of the metaphor immunity, but I want to kind of hybridize it with what Zak said, because I think what's important to note is that the epistemic black hole, it's not just a level sitting there by itself. One of the things I've been doing lately, similar to Zak looking in the past, is listening to old documentaries on the Vietnam War. And I listened to this one man who became an author and a poet, and I'm not going to remember his name, but he was saying that when he was in Vietnam, they would get their information on what was happening in the war from the newspaper. And so they would pick up the newspaper and say, in Da Nang, this is what happened. And he was in Da Nang, and that was not at all what was happening. And my niece was in the first Gulf War, and I used to write her and say, what's really happening? She says, I don't know, we watch the news every night, just like you do, to find out what's happening. And so the epistemic crisis is not just that we don't have any shared narrative. It's that people, they live in one world and the narratives don't fit what their actual experience is. And this is even true for people who then, one of the responses to project on a narrative that also doesn't fit, because there's no match to the narrative. And I think this is what a lot of people have said about, the Democratic, the last 6, 8 years or 12 years, is that the narrative, even today, I heard that, Morgan Stanley said they have so much money, they don't know what to invest it in, so they're gonna all buy it back. So the narrative of prosperity, it's not just because it's propaganda, it's just that it's true for some, but it's not, there's a disconnect. People may want to believe it, but at a certain point, the gap is too large. Right. The narratives break down. So I think that's always important to understand, is that it's not just about getting the right narrative or something clever, is actually what a country believes about themselves and what people are experiencing has to be connected. And I think that's an important part. I mean, I think that's why you can't just talk about the narrative wars or the mimetic wars or the cultural wars. Yeah. Right? It's not solved just at that level.
Sure. No, I understand. Well, I'm glad you say that now, because we wanted to bring in some other levels just to further, enrich, hopefully, the perspective on what's going on. It's difficult for all of us to find a grounding here, because we're asking, at quite a macroscopic level, but it's just very helpful to sort of get all these kind of data points of different ways of looking at it, and then to see if there's some kind of pattern arising. So with that in mind, Minna, do you want to go next and tell us how you saw what recently happened?
Sure, thank you. I'm really enjoying this conversation. And in terms of what just happened in America and what that means to the rest of the world, I approach this question in the way that I often approach any sort of social question, which is with multiple passports. But the passports that I arrive at this conversation with are not necessarily to do with my ethnicity as much as they are to do with my multiple selves, the many positions that I inhabit and that I embody in this world. It was really interesting listening to Zak, Bonnitta, and Jeremy, because in some sense the three passports of selves that I've been thinking about correspond to the three kind of different perspectives that we were just offered, even if not in any kind of neat way, because of course there's a lot of overlap between everything that has been said so far. But I come to this conversation firstly with a kind of the passport of somebody who works with words and with meaning and social criticism and epistemology. And with that passport, I resonate very much with what Zak said about just being in this place at the moment where it's hard to know who to be and what to think even, because there's just so much going on. And yet at the same time, I feel that it is perhaps necessary to still try to do that. And the way that I would go about doing that is to just simplify as much as I possibly can. I think a lot of the issue is that we're dealing with so many abstractions. And so, and as Bonnitta was saying, there is a need to kind of hone in on a intentional concreteness somehow. To me, what is going on with that hat on is that there's we have these societies that are, and the US at the forefront of them, that are devoid of love and care and ethics. Societies in which people are experiencing so much inequality and are therefore not given opportunities to edify themselves, to take part in Bildung. And so therefore, the US and societies all around the world are not producing the kind of informed citizens and civic discourse that is so desperately needed. And instead, we have a generation that are unable to really understand the difference between very glaringly obvious conspiracies and lies and reality and truths. And as a result, are what I would say are hyper paranoid. And I think that the group of people that we saw storm into Capitol are really representative of this hyper paranoia, which is obviously really receptive consequently to ideologies such as anti-Semitism and racism and sexism, etc. The second passport that I entered the conversation with is as a global citizen of African heritage. And this is where I guess I really feel that there is a need to make concrete of what is happening right now in the world. And I think, you know, as an African heritage person, I feel deeply concerned about the erosion of democracy. So in the African continent and in much of the global South, we obviously have so many weak democracies and very fragile democracies that, whether we like it or not, the US has been a kind of monitoring power of how democracy can be strengthened. And so, you know, in Nigeria, where I'm from, for instance, we now have a previous dictator who is absolutely bolstered or has been bolstered by Trump and will continue to be bolstered by leaders who are following in this kind of anti-democratic fashion, which is also why I think, you know, there's a real need to understand that the US shapes so many trends, and what we're discussing has also been happening in Europe. In Germany, there were a group of anti-vaxxers who stormed the parliament in October, I think, and many of them were waving QAnon flags. So, you know, there's really a lot of corresponding trends here. And just lastly, where I think the passport that I wear as a Black feminist of the radical tradition, you know, I really kind of resonate with what Jeremy was speaking about, particularly in terms of the kind of materialist and the socioeconomic factors that have shaped the past few weeks. And when I look at what happened on the 6th of January, it's, you know, I've seen a lot of conversations about this kind of psycho-spiritual, new agey elements of what the insurgents were doing. And I think that is far too generous. Looking at it from this lens, this is much more reminiscent to me of a kind of Ku Klux Klan type of sentiment. You know, as a Black woman, if I were in that kind of environment, I would be terrified for the kind of metaphors and symbols and actual rhetoric that is being used. I think it's much more connected to a kind of evangelical Christianity that is tied to deep institutionalized racism in the US. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Minna. And we'll have plenty of time to sort of speak together. So Anna, do you want to go next? And we'll take you and Mark in sequence, and then we'll come and reflect together.
Yeah, I think what I had thought about really fits with what Minna just said. I also find these readings of the storming of the Capitol quite problematic. Some of the readings that sort of almost seem to, you know, glamorize it as an uprising of the, you know, bubbling id energies, and not try to represent it as something mythological, spiritual, and somehow prettify it that way. And I fully agree with you, Minna, that I think it's much darker than that. And I would also say that, you know, this narrative about the kind of eruption of the irrational into the center of rational power leaves out how carefully and rationally this eruption has been engineered, it has been stoked, and it has been created by very reason-driven architects. And I would say that Trump and other populists have hyper-rational strategies for grabbing and maintaining and destabilizing power. And that they, you know, very cleverly weaponize irrational drives and emotions in their followers. And that's something very different from talking about a kind of natural eruption of the irrational. So I think that kind of irrationality has been very artificially whipped up. And, you know, as Jeremy said, it's a sort of pathological expression of irrationality, and it hasn't burst out or emerged in a natural way. And I think historically speaking, the right has always managed to hook really successfully into people's pain points, activating grievances and their irrational drives, and especially anger and hate. And so it really operates with weapons of mass emotionalization. And that's obviously an art form that Trump has mastered brilliantly. And these emotions are really very powerful emotions, and, you know, build on scapegoating techniques, one of the oldest techniques in the, you know, populist playbook for creating a sense of community that is, you know, that rests on a shared enemy. And in order to trigger these kinds of emotion, you know, the right has always used archetypal and mythological and spiritual imagery and symbolism. The Nazi have done that with pagan and Norse and occult references. So that's all nothing new, I would say. And I do think that we shouldn't understand the rise of QAnon and so on as a sign of a wider spiritual or irrational or mythopoetic turn, but rather as an act of mass manipulation that weaponizes spiritual and irrational yearnings, and uses imagery and symbolism to achieve very specific outcomes. And I think the emotionalization of any discourse, especially political ones, is always a double-edged sword. It's something that is very dangerous because it's hard to control, it's hard to direct, as we have seen, because it always develops a life of its own. But it also, at the same time, without emotionalizing our discourses, without speaking to people at a level that involves affect and grabs them and motivates them, and we have no chance of mobilizing anyone at scale. So I think it's an interesting problem, this kind of emotionalization of our discourses. And Bonnitta mentioned before the idea of you know, turning away from narratives and being too fused with our narratives and returning to concrete intentions instead. And I think that's a really, really powerful idea that chimes with me. And Zak mentioned the idea of the meta-political and the meta-psychological stance in all of this. And I'm really interested in the metaphor of defusing from our political narratives. And that's diffusion is a technique that is very important in ACT therapy, in acceptance and commitments therapy. And it's the idea of creating distance between what your mind tells you, your emotions, your thoughts, and your observing self. So you create a gap, and in that gap lies the power to make wiser choices. And I think at a social level, we can try to defuse from the political narratives and really return to values-driven intentions and actions instead. And I think that would be really powerful. And I think to a certain extent, Biden has actually done that, because he has, in the run-up to the election, I think very wisely refrained from culture warring back. So he has actually just refused to engage in the narrative warfare. And so he kind of treated Trump and what he said more as noise, you know, as something, you know, that like bad thoughts that pop up in your head and that you notice, but you don't respond to them. You let them pass. And I think there's something in that metaphor that can be, going forward, be quite an interesting way of coping with narratological warfare by sort of stepping outside of it and looking at narratives as narratives, and at, you know, and just simply differentiating between the ones that are more helpful and less helpful when it comes to concrete values and intentions and actions. And just a last thought, yesterday I watched the BBC News, and there was a journalist who invited a Republican congressman and a Democrat congresswoman on the show. And the first question he asked them was, so what do you like about the other party's program? And it was such a kind of disarming and very powerful question, because he just forced them to step out and to actually think about that. And it was a completely different conversation, because they actually managed to talk about some values that they respected in each other's programs, rather than engaging in the narrative warfare mode in which people normally talk and meet. So it was a really moving journalistic intervention, which resulted in a really productive debate and a very simple technique, really.
Thank you. And it's worth thinking about how we might apply that at scale, of course, is the big challenge, but interesting to think about as an angle. So Mark, finally, I mean, in addition to everything else you want to say, I'm keen to get to this idea of why we on the other side of the Atlantic might care so much as well. How did you see what happened in America?
Well, I mean, to leap straight in there, I think that it's because it raises the question of what is democracy's promise? I mean, it takes us back to very basic things, not just how to do democracy, but what is it actually promising? And when I was thinking about it with the hat I have on, having studied the ancient Greeks, you know, this was a question that's always been around in democracy. And the thing that I felt looking in from the outside, and I do feel a bit wary about how that can miss so much, and so it can be a kind of false perception. But the thing that struck me really was that in this moment of democratic crisis, what happened was that the aristocrats came in. And this actually was what Plato and Aristotle concluded democracy needs, is it needs the kind of nobles who believe and embody the virtues. They may not be perfect, but at least they can transmit them. And they can remind the democracy that it's about more than just democracy. There's some transcendent reference that it needs, which the aristocrats can stand for. You know, the word meaning the power of the best, if you like. Which it can devolve into oligarchy, where the so-called best just wield their power, but it's at its best, it means that that which is good, beautiful, and true has power in the democracy. And I was very struck that the three presidents appeared to try and project some of that. It was very striking how virtues were not just celebrated, but sung in verse. And in a way, that was the moment that stole the show. And when Amanda Gorman sang of the virtues in verse and concluded with "Be the light." I think this is because, to swing this back to what other people were saying, perhaps, see if this rings for them, of course, but you know, epistemology needs the power of the best, if you like. Otherwise, it just swings around and falls into black holes. And similarly, you know, one way of thinking about an immune system is that it's about returning to a homeostasis. And that might be about a kind of compass point that's got lost because the best has been lost sight of. You know, this is about not just having freedom, but asking what freedom is for. And that is a question that gets very rarely asked because it's perceived as being too loaded a question, often it seems. But maybe that's something which we need to ask of ourselves now. It's also, I think, for me, I'm not so sure that the world's getting that much more complex and that irrationality has more and more of a say. I think it's more that which makes rational, which is to have some sense of what rationality is for. That, again, has been lost. So it's another kind of reflection upon this need for something more than just democracy, more than just epistemology, you know, which was standard fare, of course, in pre-modern epistemologies. It's only really become a problem since the so-called death of God, as Nietzsche pointed out, and so we feel we're swinging through empty space and the horizon's been wiped away and so on. Now, it worried me a bit too, because alongside the virtues being sung, it felt there was quite a competition with meritocracy being reinstated. And for me, it just seemed like the perniciousness of meritocracy was displayed in front of the Capitol when you've got all those individuals with presumably extraordinarily high net worth amongst them celebrating meritocracy, where clearly that doesn't exist. No one, you know, not everyone can dream of being president. And so those kind of false virtues, if you like, I think need to be addressed as well. you know, when democracy was first dreamt up, Aristotle concluded that the good thing about democracy was it was the most friendly constitution. There are other constitutions, other ways of organizing life, but democracy was the most friendly. And it's always struck me as a very modest way of celebrating democracy. It's a bit E.M. Forster-ish, 2 cheers for democracy. And you know, now the great risk is that we ask it almost to deliver salvation. It's become a sort of semi-religious enterprise, delivering a material heaven on earth, delivering a solid identity. Everyone can be of infinite value, given unconditional love, provided with unshakable security. This is just too much. And so it shakes and judders. So just to conclude, in a way, what I'm saying, I think we need to return to the pre-political as much as thinking about the political. We need to ask these very basic questions about human desire, about what it's to know the good, the beautiful, and the true. I mean, this might well come through in practical projects like Bonnitta was suggesting, or, you know, Zak's phrase, to take us right back to the beginning, which I made a note of ensoulment dynamics. You know, how are we participating in life? That's another question which I love. But maybe that, you know, that's what I've taken anyway, that crisis has always been inherent in democracy. But what's democracy for? What's freedom for? What's life about? And where is the best within us, to use another phrase of Aristotle? So these seem to me to be the questions which I get drawn to anyway.
Gosh, thanks a lot, Mark. That's much appreciated, and makes me wonder where to go next, because it leaves me feeling, you know, excited to explore that question of what democracy is for, but equally quickly aware that, of course, as a design principle, democracy doesn't want to prejudge that answer, right? I think that, as I understand it, and I know there's a huge tradition of democratic theory that calls this into question, but part of the challenge is that democracy is that which allows us to discuss what is good and to explore what is beautiful and true. Maybe not true though. Maybe that's what makes us interesting. Maybe there's something there about, you know, the good might be an open question and the beautiful might be a matter of taste to some extent, but the true presumably is somewhat more solid. And it comes back to this issue of the preconditions for democracy to work. Now, what you say about expecting far too much for democracy being sacralized and fetishized even, I chime with. But I am quite interested in, you know, yes, it's not entirely an epistemological matter, but getting the epistemology of democracy right might be a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for a viable shared world. And I guess that's part of what I feel at the moment. It's like, if the truth is not a premise upon which to build discussions about the good and the beautiful, I think you risk the collapse of a shared civic discourse and the gradual weaponization of untethered narratives that will inevitably collide with each other, first in words and then with weapons. So, you know, I am quite scared by what I saw. I mean, it's far away. You know, I've been there in DC. I know the places, but it still felt, in some ways, symbolically. This is why I mentioned Logos and Mythos at the beginning. There was a sense in which the forces of irrationality, whatever their antecedents, socioeconomic, pseudo-spiritual, racial, you know, whatever they were, those are nonetheless features of our shared world. And they were there in evidence, manifest in mob form, arguably just not sufficiently powerful mob form. You know, a few more people and a few more weapons and everything might have been somewhat different. So I guess I just want anyone to tell me why we shouldn't be extraordinarily daunted and even a little scared. Is there a reason to believe that what just happened is the beginning of some reckoning that will lead to some new forms of engagement with what democracy is and is not? Or is it indeed the case that we might be horribly compromised at a socioeconomic level, you know, completely epistemologically lost and without access to a conversation about the good, the beautiful, and the true in public? Who would like to take on that first? Can I appoint someone? Can I volunteer someone? Who looks like they want to speak most? Jeremy, you do. Go ahead.
Sure. I don't think I can really tackle that question appropriately. However, I would say both are true, that we are in a very tenuous space right now, and that the responses to that could be democratic, could be an exploration and examination of, okay, well, what do we need to meaningfully transform in our society to enable democracy to revivify itself, to transform the conditions that have engendered QAnon and the mass movements, et cetera, and the kind of scary, the scary turn that we saw on the Capitol. Those conditions are not necessarily going to be answered by an oligarchic institutional concentration of power. And those, in fact, it is because of that concentration of power, the discontent, which is legitimate, manifested in a kind of irrational way and dangerous way, that we need to address. So I think, the response has to be more along the lines of what I believe Bonnitta was saying, in terms of like, well, what do we want to transform and how do we do it together? And like, let's build a consensus around that, because that to me seems to be really the only way forward. How do we transform in a meaningful way the material, psycho-spiritual conditions of everybody, in terms of what drove these issues. So I think transformation is really the only way through. Oh, you're muted again.
Jesus.
There you go.
Yeah, Jeremy, I know you may have to go at this point, so you're welcome to make a graceful exit on that call for transformation if you like.
Cool, that's perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody. Looking forward to hearing the rest.
Cool. So yeah, the thing about transformation, I've been saying this recently, is that, yeah, I can see why, with everything that people have described, it feels like something fundamental has to happen. And yet, when we evoke words like transformation, it's very question begging, right? Because everyone has a different vision of what that means. If you ask your, there's not one view of that, and not everyone. We wouldn't necessarily. Those calling for transformation can actually be calling for radically different views of the world with different underlying values and priorities. And in some ways, that's what we want, right? I guess I'm trying to get at this idea of, if one of the things that makes democracy of value is that it's not a finished product, and it doesn't foreclose views of what we're living for prematurely, and yet Mark is also surely right that it has to have some kind of telos or sort of overarching value structure that is more than just deliberation. But then how do we get back to something like that is at once a kind of noble ideal, but also fundamentally open?
I mean, just to chip in there, another word which struck me was when Minna said Bildung, which is this expansive education that we don't really have now. But that was actually Plato's response, in a way, was don't worry so much about vision within your politics, but do give people a good education in this richest sense, which includes things like virtue and so on, the education of their desire, as much as anything else, and that feels like we don't really have that, right? Certainly not at the state level. So that's quite a big gap that might do a lot of the work that you're looking for without having to solve problems about what the good, the beautiful, and the true actually is. Yeah,
and I suppose, Zach, a good time to ask you the chance of that. Not so much the chance of that happening; it's a bit facile, but is that a sort of credible hope, if you like? Is it something that could manifest?
I mean, again, back to the 30 Years' War, right? Like, transformation is painful. Transformation, especially social transformation, historically speaking, is usually violent. It's only really relatively recent history where we get relatively nonviolent social transformation. So your sense that this feels like a dangerous moment is accurate. And then if you expand beyond the United States and you look at what the weakening of the United States means geopolitically for the rest of the world, that becomes interesting as well. Then you're left with basically China as the world superpower. And when you look at Minna's mention of Africa and the role the United States used to have in Africa, and now the role that China has in Africa, China is basically in East Africa in particular running the show. And so you have to step back and look at the precarity of democracy in the United States as actually setting off a lot of broader geopolitical possibilities. So the danger expands just beyond civil unrest in the United States, which I think will likely continue. And the autoimmune effect of a left purge of the right is, I think, also likely.
Right.
And at least the near-term increasing of the left becoming what it hates, I think, is likely as part of that autoimmune response, the incivility of the aristocracy and pseudo-meritocracy. And again, the notion that the Democrats have retained power now, we turn on the happy music and everything is good, is incorrect. You have to remember that Occupy Wall Street took place on Obama's watch. Obama launched more drone strikes than any president in history. And the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which was one of the first things that Trump got out of, is universally considered by people who are concerned about global economic inequality as a massively complex and problematic global trade agreement. And there's already steps being taken to reinitiate that. So I think we will see soon a remembering of the left that it was once divided against itself. And the collective scapegoat that has emerged now, the left is allowed to turn the Trumpists into something that could basically, we can do anything we want to. They are now a scapegoat. That will occur. You will get the purge, and then the left will do what it always does and form a circular firing squad, and you will get internal scapegoating. So you're not seeing a resolution to the problem of democracy with the ascendancy of the left in the United States. And again, I'm saying the epistemological black hole, like there's actually no going back to the way we used to stabilize global geopolitical blocks. There's no going back to that. There's no going back to the way we used to solve the tensions in the United States between classes and races. So something new has to truly emerge. And this gets to Mark's point about education. I think this is the goal. There's a weird little esoteric moment here where John Amos Comenius, the great educational reformer who basically gave us modern education, was invited to be the president of Harvard when Harvard was a wilderness outpost colony, basically. What this tells us is actually that the core of the American aristocracy that would eventually initiate the revolution was more interested in Comenius than many other possible people. And when you look at Jefferson and you look at the founding documents, you're looking at an educationally oriented democracy by definition. It had to be. They all agreed. And it wasn't just like reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was moral and religious education in particular. And so, yeah, Dewey's democracy and education being a necessary equation is more true now than ever. But again, print to TV to digital, we have to think of what is the emergent form of that type of education, right? It's not going to be a revivification of Comenius. Comenius built the modern. We need something new, radically new, likely digital. So yeah, that's the hope. But again, in the near term, we're looking at, yeah, it's a very volatile situation, and it's likely to continue to get worse before it gets better. Although some of the narratives now will start shifting towards telling us that it's getting better. So that's my somewhat jaded view, I suppose.
You say jaded. Does anyone want to speak to any sense of optimism or hope? Anna, you said earlier today you felt hopeful. Do you feel hopeful, like geopolitically, or was it just the sun shining?
Yeah, I think it was the sun tricked me. No, I think what is really, also comparing the US situation to the situation in the UK, I think we all experienced a bit of jealousy because, in a way, looking at it superficially, you had a very bad 4 years, and then someone comes in and signs all these presidential decrees and undoes a lot of what has been done. I know it's all at a symbolic level mainly, but there is a sort of, someone built the wall, someone else comes in and tears it down again. So you could have a seesaw pattern of, people undoing each other's work at a fairly regular, wavy, long time period. Whereas I think in the UK, with Brexit, that can't be undone in a kind of 4-year movement, and it feels much more permanent, and it feels much more, there to last throughout our lifetime. But I think what you all talked about before about the material conditions and what happened, underneath the Trump theater show, you know, the kind of structural, social and economic transformations that you mentioned. I think that is the really worrying bit, and quite a lot of the other stuff is sort of distraction that keeps us from noticing. And in that sense, again, Trump has been incredibly effective, you know, because he centered all the attention on himself, whilst all of these other things were going almost unnoticed underneath. So no, I'm not really offering an optimistic perspective here. I think what I find hope inspiring is that so many people are developing this meta level of awareness, though, you know, about narratives, about meta perspectives, about system thinking, about sense making. All of these discourses, I think, are percolating down, and they are going to become more integrated into education. I mean, that's the big hope, that these discourses will, at some level, begin to be integrated and to be taught as skills that we all have to develop once again. And I think this is where I feel optimistic, that there will be sort of sense making and narrative detecting skills development at scale at some point, you know, and I think that is bound to happen soon. I have a sense that, you know, the idea that the complexity we're grappling with is becoming so overwhelming that we actually need to go back to our complexity processing skills. That seems to me an idea that I encounter in lots of different discourses, you know, a pattern that is beginning to emerge, and hopefully that will offer some hope.
Okay, thanks, Anna. So we have just a few minutes left, maybe enough time for 1 minute each of those who haven't. So for Mark, Minna, Bonnie, and Zak, I think what I most want to ask is less about US politics and more about democracy as such. I think what I want to ask is whether you think the future is democratic, and if so, what form it might take. We begin with Minna.
Is the future democratic? It has to be. I think, you know, we were speaking earlier about expecting too much from democracy. And I would say in contrast that we need to expect more from democracy. I hope that the events that are taking place right now, and with the new US president, that there will be an impetus to examine democracy more. There definitely isn't any kind of golden age where democracy functioned in any kind of egalitarian way. You know, I think it's quite interesting to note how comparing sort of China's relationship to Africa with America's relationship to Africa, China, for all of the ills that it is doing in the African continent at the moment, it doesn't have any sort of military bases in the continent. So it isn't an imperialist nation. It's exploitative in terms of resources. The US and Europe have had and have military bases. So that kind of compromises what we would call, what we might argue is the democratic nature of America and Europe. And so ultimately, I would hope that our democracies are going to be infused with something that has become so unfashionable of recent, which is a kind of humanitarianism. I think that our world desperately needs a more humane politics, and what that will probably lead toward, if that were to happen, is that we start to see ourselves more as world citizens, because really and truly that is how our socioeconomics and our politics are functioning at the moment in so many important ways. And yet we still have this really jingoistic, nationalistic, and patriotic view of ourselves as members of nations. So a more humanitarian and a more emphasis on democracy is what I hope for.
Okay, thank you. Bonnie, my instinct is you might want to go next.
Yeah, so I didn't have an answer, and what Minna said was really provocative to me. And so I think democracy is a kind of system that is transparent to the people in it. So if the people in your democracy are not humane, then democracy is not going to be humanitarian. You can create humanitarian systems by other means, perhaps. But I think what democracy means is that it's more porous to the actual values and virtues and ideas that are in the system. And so maybe that's a little tension between those two things that we are seeing in the autoimmune response or something. So that's an interesting question. And I just kind of had that idea right now. But I think that, I don't know if the future, now that I'm thinking it this way, is democratic. But I think democracy has an immune response. And I think that few people understand the immune response and why it's helpful. You know, if you're sick and you get a fever, it's helpful. It doesn't make you feel good, but it's actually part of the health of the body. And I think that in many cases, a lot of what we are shoving underground or repressing or not allowing to speak are the immune responses of a healthy democracy. So to that extent, I feel hopeful.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. So Zach, not more than 1 minute, please. Is the future democratic?
I would say it depends what you mean by democracy and where you want to see it. The vast majority of organizations, especially large international organizations, are not run like democracies. They're run like authoritarian regimes. You're fired or not. You don't get to vote. There are a few exceptions to that. And with Minna, there's a sense of, have we ever really had a democracy? It's an interesting question. Technically, we've had a republic or an oligarchy. And so my sense is probably not the near-term future. I think we're looking at a near-term future where things become less democratic. And perhaps beyond that, we begin to merge a mixture of democracy and egalitarianism and meritocracy and create some kind of more complex form of government that isn't simply democracy. But in the near term, we're looking at something more like a return to a neo-feudalism. This is my hypothesis.
Great, can't wait. I'm just kidding. Mark, finally, I know you have to go, so I'll encourage you to
thanks.
Brief.
Well, in a way, maybe this is the way of putting something of what Zach was just saying, thinking of democracy as an adjective rather than a noun. It reminded me of when I'm a psychotherapist and worked in a mental health hospital for quite a while, and particularly in the unit with people who have this diagnosis of personality disorder, which has been one that's banded around a lot in the last 4 years. And it's very destructive. And every so often what would have to happen is the whole ward would have to get together and you sit down for a long time, maybe a whole day, and everyone would have a voice. It became a democratic place rather than the rather feudal places that wards often are with the consultant at the top. And that was the only way to build a complete picture, to try to put the splits which the personality disorder engenders in quite astonishing ways. You would not believe it unless you've seen it, although maybe we have seen it, so we do believe it a bit more. And tell a story with everyone having a voice. So it's a kind of democratic, what that means at scale, I don't know. I mean, I thought about truth and reconciliation commissions, and I quite like that as well, because it does also bring in my yearning for something that's transcendent, a kind of vertical line as well as the horizontal, because I think what, insofar as they did work in South Africa and also in Northern Ireland, was that there was a Mandela figure and a David Trimble figure that could stand for something that the process on the horizontal was trying to aspire towards, even if it found it hard to name that. There was a sort of sense of it coming in, at least on occasion. Now, it's not perfect, of course, I'm far, far from it, but that's as good as I can think. Democratic is an adjective, the friendliest place, not the perfect place.
Okay, thank you. So in adjectives we trust, in a sense. So thank you very much to Zak Stein, Bonnitta Roy, Katharina Schaffner, Minna Salami, Mark Vernon, and Jeremy Johnson, who left a little earlier. I'm Jonathan Rowson, Director of Perspectiva, and thanks for watching. Bye.